that loud enough? It's intelligent, it's not loud enough. Is that loud enough? Huh? One more time. Yeah. I'm hoping this is a good version. Okay. I'll let that play, but I'm going to talk over it. We're getting ready to talk about immigration, and I want to apologize for the late notice on Tuesday, but I was told I had to stay home, so I had to stay home this Tuesday. I'm sure y'all didn't mind sleeping in a little bit. And I didn't want to just let you show up in an empty classroom, so I figured a late night email would be too taken too badly, or taken too badly, yeah. But what we were going to talk about on Wednesday, what we're going to talk about today, which is immigration. And I love how things get recycled. This is closer to the original version of this song. It's an Irish drinking song. Metallica's redone it. The big hit for Metallica. Well, not one of the biggest, but it was a hit. Apparently Thin Lizzy did it. The Grateful Dead did it back in the day. So history just keeps coming back. So I figured y'all would enjoy the Metallica version of it. And the reason I'm playing it is because, or the reason I even brought it up, this is one of the contributions. I'm trying to talk over, sorry. That the Irish brought. And this is the kind of music people were listening to in the 1830s, 1820s, 1810s. Irish drinking songs were really popular, and a lot of things get set to drinking songs, like Battle Hymn of the Republic and Star Spangled Banner. A lot of songs are set to drinking songs. The Stupid Barney song is set to an Irish drinking song, which is really hysterical when you know that and your kids are singing it through the house, and you know it's an Irish drinking song. But the Irish will come in droves. Immigration had stalled from Europe during the Napoleonic War and during the War of 1812, but land and jobs in America were plentiful, or at least that was the story everybody was telling. The people who had come had sent back, turn your volume down or don't watch videos, because I can hear you. The people who had come before sent back glowing reports. You know, in a letter from one lady, there's no sending children to bed without supper or husbands to work without dinner in their pails or bags. It was a land of plenty, and everybody wanted to come here. Things haven't changed. And An Englishman writing in 1834 wrote, "America's ideal for the poor man that is industrious, for he is want for nothing." The idea of that rags to riches, you can do anything you want, you could be anything you want, you're not stuck in a social status, abounded across the ocean. And people came across. Between 1845 and 1854, almost 2.4 million people immigrated to the United States. Most were Irish, German, or British in this wave. And it doesn't matter whenever, because we're going to talk about immigration will come in waves. And whatever wave the new immigration is, they're on the bottom. Now the British kind of had a little bit of a step up. They could blend in a little bit better. The Germans and Irish, not as much. And they're going to be the ones that are going to have the most hatred aimed at them. And of these three, it's going to be the Irish. There is a lot of anti-Irish sentiment that's going to spring up in the United States. Put that one up there. That has a lot on it. I don't know why I put that much on my slide. Sorry. The Irish were coming out of a prolonged depression. In fact, things in Ireland had gotten so bad, and that should be the 1845 potato famine. With the 1845 potato famine, that the average age of death in Ireland was 19. That's pretty young to have, most of the people dying are around 18 or 19. The potato famine had killed more than 1 million peasants. The trip across the ocean is going to kill probably around 40,000, or well, a lot more. Just in 1847 alone, it killed 40,000. They called them coffin ships because they would pack them in so tightly. Not as bad as the slave ships, but if they could get one more in. They were sickly to begin with. You've got a long voyage. So a lot of people died in the passage. But by 1850, Irish are going to make up 43% of the foreign-born population in the United States. They didn't come with money, so they usually stayed close to where they landed. If you have money, you could move inland, buy a farm, get some land, set up a shop. No money means, what do you do when you have no money? You don't eat. You get a job. So most of these people, the Irish that landed, immediately found work. Construction crews, building the canals, the railroads, working in iron foundries, steel mills, warehouses, mines, shipyards. The women worked as servants, laundresses. They worked in the textile mills. You come with nothing. You got to start somewhere. You got to get a job, which also meant that they didn't migrate far, at least not initially. So New York, Boston are filling up with Irish, and there are a lot. Like I said, there's a lot of anti-Irish sentiment. People post jobs, no Irish need apply. It's going to get kind of rough. However, they did make it work. Well, I have my anti-Irish sentiment further down on the slide, but let me finish that. So a lot of the anti-Irish sentiment came from anti-Catholic prejudice. It took me a while to actually get a grip on this, because it's like, what's wrong with being Catholic?
The problem that people had with Catholicism is that Catholicism answers to one person. It's the same problem they had with the Masonic Lodge. That there is a person, an entity that is above your nationality that you answer to. And in this case, it's the Pope. Now, answering to God is one thing. The Pope is a human. And not only is he a human, he is a human with political power. You don't always think of the Pope having political power, but particularly in the 1800s and earlier, he did. Popes named kings. And so there was this idea that the Irish Catholics would be more loyal to their religion than they would be to the country. And that they were setting the country up for the Pope to take over, which is a little far-fetched, but was a fear that existed. There were also ethnic prejudices. The Irish hate the English hate the Irish. A lot of Americans were English to begin with. Some were Irish to begin with. And there were a lot of demeaning stereotypes. We won't go into that, but stereotypes abound at this time. If you actually want to see some of the interesting ones, go buy one of those cheap $1 Walmart cartoons that they have on DVD up near the cash register. You can get every demeaning stereotype you want. Japanese, Chinese, Hispanic, German, Irish, because they're all done in like the 40s and 50s when the same racism was still very, very strong, and it comes out in these cartoons. Again, it's kind of funny to watch when your kids are enjoying their cartoons. They see nothing. They don't get it, but you get all the stereotypes. But some Irish were very accomplished. Most lived normal lives. Maybe most actually did make their life better than what they had in Ireland. Ireland was pretty rough in the early 1800s. Potato famine was bad. But some did very, very well. A man named Alexander Stewart owned the nation's largest department store and was a real estate mogul in New York City. Michael Cudahy had Cudahy Packing Company. He developed a form of refrigeration that was desperately needed because preserving meat is much easier with refrigeration. Victor Hubert was a composer. So you had some very popular, positive role models as well. And the other thing that bothered a lot of Americans was that the Irish were very clannish. Irishmen will find other Irishmen. And as these immigrants settle in the U.S., and this will be a pattern that's repeated, it's the pattern we had before. You go where people you know are. So you'd have like a little Italy, a little Ireland, a little Chinatown once we start getting Italians and Chinese. But right now we're talking about the Irish. So Irish would congregate together in the same areas. And a lot of times even down to where they came from in Ireland. Like everybody from one county would be, because they would know each other. And there was a familiarity there and a support system. But they also tended to vote together. They were very powerful voting blocs. Jackson used this much to his advantage. They were drawn to him and the Democrats. And then that fear of the Catholic Church, the last thing on there, By 1860, Catholicism is the largest denomination in the U.S. So there, and the nativists, which we will talk about in a little bit, looked at that as proof, that what they feared was going to happen. The Germans, they're the next big group. The Germans peaked in 1854 because of a failed German Revolution in 1848. A lot of intellectual Germans were leaving Germany. They were on the wrong side of the failed revolution. When you're on the wrong side of a failed revolution, the easiest, best thing to do is to get out. So we have an influx of doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers. The Germans came a little more prepared. They settled in more rural areas. They could buy farms. They had a little more money. They brought with them a lot of different faiths. About a third were Catholic. Most were Lutherans. You had some Jews. You had some free-thinking atheists or agnostics. But like I said, they arrived with the means to get themselves started, and they arrived in family groups. The Irish was almost a 50-50 blend of men and women, but they weren't necessarily families. And in fact, there were a few more women than there were men. But the Germans came as family groups, and a lot more of them are going to return to Germany later, after they kind of either don't get a start or get a start. About 14% will return to Germany, as opposed to 9% of the Irish. The last group is kind of a mixed group. I put British originally, and the British were still coming in large numbers. And a lot of these were professionals, independent farmers, and skilled workers. They could find jobs readily. If you were an independent farmer and you had the means, you could set up your own farm. They were adding to, like the skilled workers you needed for all of this new technology that was coming in. And they're still coming in large numbers. You're also going to get Norwegians and Swedes. You get a wave of them, and they're going to gravitate to Wisconsin and Minnesota because it's very similar in climate to Scandinavia, and they came with the means to set themselves up. The Chinese are going to be the Irish of the Pacific. They're going to land on the California coast, and they're going to work on the railroads primarily. If they end up primarily in construction. Now, their story is a little different. Obviously, they're a different group. They are going to face a lot of racism. A lot of the Chinese came with the intention of making their money and going home. Unlike the Irish, who just wanted to survive. We just want to live somewhere and, not die. The Chinese came with the intention of making their fortune and going back. Some did, a lot didn't, but they're going to be a big force in the California area, at least on the West Coast, adding to the culture there. Now, all of these immigrants were not welcomed with open arms. Not everybody cared, but there is going to be a strong backlash to immigration. And every group had its fear associated with it. The Chinese brought opium. The Irish were going to turn us all into Catholics. The Germans were going to start another revolution. They were going to encourage political radicalism. So there were a lot of things that the nativists, the Native Americans, not meaning the Indians, but the original groups that came in and had been, proliferating in the United States. The poor Native Americans still don't get a hand in any of this. So we're not talking about the Indians. You're going to get a lot of backlash. In 1834, Lyman Beecher, who was a congregational minister, after a series of sermons, got a mob so worked up that they assaulted an Ursuline convent in Charleston, Massachusetts. I think they burned it. In 1844, there were armed clashes between Protestants and Catholics in Philadelphia. In 1837, a Native American Association was established in Washington, D.C. It rocked along for a while. It didn't do a whole lot other than, spout American slogans. In 1844, however, a new group was organized, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, and it was organized in New York City. And kind of like the Anti-Masonic League, it's going to grow into a third party, the American Party. It was a weird party. It was almost run like a fraternal organization, like the Masons. Everybody that was, so everybody meaning the white men that ran this organization, because, at this point it's white men voters. They had initiation rites. They had rituals and ceremonies, but when asked anything about their party, they said they knew nothing. So they became the Know Nothing Party. So when you're reading your history and you hear about the Know Nothing Party, this is a nativist party that is based on their whole party platform is based on the exclusion of immigrants and Catholics. They would like to keep them from coming in the country altogether, but they would be happy if they could exclude them from public office. And they want to extend the naturalization time period from 5 years to 25 years. So if you come over, you can become a citizen in 5 years at this point. They want it to be 25 years, which is probably going to exceed the lifespan of some of the immigrants. And they want them forever excluded from any public office, which is kind of going to narrow your pool of candidates if you have to be born in the United States. So immigration is a major issue at this time. And the country is growing. I mean, it's growing by leaps and bounds. And the immigrants are a big part of that because they're part of the population growth. They're a big part of the population growth. And without them, we would have had a lot of the infrastructure because they were the labor force. And speaking of labor, let's talk about organized labor for a minute. We haven't really talked about unions in the United States. That's because they're just now starting. Colonial period, they use the apprenticeship system that kind of comes out of the guild system, where if you want to learn a trade, you're apprenticed to somebody who knows that trade. So if you want to be a carpenter, or if your parents want you to be a carpenter, when you're 8 or 9 years old, they basically indenture you, in a sense, to a carpenter. And they don't, there is a contract, but it's not like a slave, it's not like an indentureship. But you become that person's helper and you learn the trade. Um, and they work within this guild system. And there's a progression. So you start out as an apprentice, then you become a journeyman, and then you become, I don't know all the steps, until you become a master craftsman. And then you can take on apprentices and you can train them. And that was mostly the artisans, the craftsmen, the mechanics, but things have changed. A lot of things are mechanized now. You don't have quite as many, you have more factory made goods than you have handmade goods. But those people who are working in the factories or working in single trades are starting to realize that they need to get organized. The early unions had some issues. They fought some legal obstacles. They were considered unlawful conspiracies. It was unlawful for a group to get together to set prices, because that was considered an artificial way, and it took out competition. So if you were a cobbler and you were friends with all the other cobblers in town, you could say, okay, shoe repairs are going to cost this much money. That's illegal. You're supposed to just deal independently. And that's what people viewed the first unions as. And they were, so that was a legal obstacle. But they overcome that in 1842, Commonwealth versus Hunt. The Massachusetts Supreme Court rules that forming a trade union in and of itself is not illegal, nor was the demand that employers only hire members of the union. And it also stated that workers could strike if an employer hired non-union labor. So if a group in employment formed a union, they could demand that their employer only hire people within their union. Most of the unions early on were one city, one craft. Like you'd have all the cobblers in Philadelphia, all the silver makers in Boston. But then all the cobblers in Boston, if they formed a union, they wouldn't really talk with the one in Philadelphia. They didn't go, it was one city, one craft. And the cobblers in Boston didn't deal with the silversmiths in Boston, just on basic workers' rights even. But they're starting to grow. Between 1827 and 1837, they get a little bit bigger. In 1834, a national trade union was set up to try to federate the city societies. So they're trying to suck in all these city groups and say, hey, you may be cobblers, you may be silversmiths, but we all want shorter working hours. We all want better pay. Maybe if we all work together, there is strength in numbers. So you're starting this, and this union was a craft union for shoemakers, printers, carpenters, and hand loom weavers. So they didn't bring in everybody. They left out the silversmiths that I've made up, but that's okay. They're getting a start, but the Panic of 1837 is going to pretty much put an end to all of the union activity for a while. It's there under the surface, and it's going to affect things later, but I mention it because you need to know that they start, that workers are starting to say, hey, I may be just a worker, but maybe I have some rights. Maybe we can get together and make some changes. because they haven't been working in factories all that long in the United States. The factories are just starting. And that's where you're really going to get some issues. Now, labor is also going to get involved in politics, because it always does. Everything gets involved in politics. They work for the removal of property qualifications for voting, which isn't a horribly big issue because everybody else has been working to get rid of the property qualifications for voting. There's a few parties that are formed. The Working Men's Party is formed in Philadelphia in 1828. It doesn't last very long, mostly because the major parties will co-opt the good things that the working people want. You know, if the Working Party puts forth, we want shorter hours, the Democrats will take, oh, well, you know, maybe we should put that on our platform. And then they'll come over to us because we also have all this other stuff and they just have a smaller platform. And that happens. But they did succeed in drawing, I mean, that in itself is a success, that they got the major parties to co-opt some of their programs. And what they were asking for is not just shorter working hours, free public education. Most people associate public education with a middle class issue. In early America, it was a working class issue. Most immigrants realized that education was how their children were going to get ahead. And they wanted their kids to be educated, but they couldn't afford to send them to private schools. So we want free public education. Abolition of debtors' prisons. I've never quite understood the whole debtor prison thing. You owe money, so they throw you in jail where you can't earn money until you can pay the debt off. But they want to get rid of that. A 10-hour workday. Most people at this time, there were no limits on your workday. So a 10-hour workday was a short workday. Nobody worked a 10-hour workday. And we're talking at least 6 days a week, if not 7 days a week. In 1836, Jackson, after a shipyard strike, did set 10-hour workdays for some government jobs. Van Buren is going to take that platform and run with it, and he is going to set that all government offices and projects can only work 10 hours. But that's still, you're working 60 hours a week. They also wanted attention drawn to mechanics lien laws, limits to militia service, abolition of child labor, restrictions on prison labor. Prison labor was a problem because it offered competition. We're talking chain gangs, where and it was more in the South, but I think the North had some issues with it as well. Instead of hiring labor, I go to the local jail and I get a chain gang to work my farm. You pay the state, it's much cheaper. And that cuts into the working man's money because they're not getting hired. They also have some hard money issues. They get into the paper money versus hard money. This is also a time when you have, we may finish this if I look it up, the rise of professions. With the growth of new towns, you need services, retail jobs, printing, post offices, newspapers, schools, banks, law firms, doctors. All of these require specialized knowledge. Not anybody can just walk in and run a printing press. Not anybody is made out to be a journalist and write what needs to go on the printing press. Not everybody can be a store owner. There's a lot of professional jobs. Professional workers are basically those who have specialized knowledge and skills. That's a pretty basic definition. And it was kind of the epitome of the democratic ideal. That was the goal, to be a professional, not just a worker, but to be a professional, to own your own business, to have a skill. And it was considered the reward of hard work, ambition, and merit. Some of these things haven't changed. Most people still do have a certain level, a level of innate respect for people who have professional positions. It's kind of waned. 2 generations ago, a generation ago, doctors were considered infallible. Now most people do at least want a second opinion sometimes. But it is a reward of hard work. You work hard, you get this job. And there's also at this time a rapid expansion of higher learning. There's a market economy. There is growth that lends itself to the growth of professionalism. Teaching was the fastest growing vocation. It was initially considered a male job. It was kind of a stepping stone. Men would teach, then they would become a clerk for a lawyer, and they would train under the lawyer. It was kind of a stepping stone. None of these professions had professional standards, however, and that becomes an issue. You could become a teacher because you knew how to read and write. You could become a lawyer by practicing with another lawyer. There are some schools that are starting that teach these things, but most of it is still sort of on that guild system. Physicians are another one. There's little formal training for physicians. And actually, physicians at this time kind of lose some stature because there's a lot of quacks. And there's a lot of weird cures, at least by our standards, which I know we should not judge them by our standards, but there are. The one professional career that had a lot of standing and training was engineering. And engineers were needed for building. It's the largest profession in the nation, and it will, by the Civil War, it's the fastest growing, and it is government backed. People are learning engineering at West Point. The government is training engineers, and these are mostly male jobs. The women were still primarily in the home. I think I need to switch slides. Oh, no, I needed to switch slides before. Sorry. Nursing was starting to be acceptable for women to a point. Nursing is not going to get totally acceptable for women until the Civil War, because it was considered unseemly for a woman to see any part of a man's body. Like a man without a shirt, you weren't, that wasn't, if it wasn't your husband, you weren't supposed to see it. And it's kind of hard to be a nurse if you can't see your patient. But by the Civil War, they're so desperate that that's going to go out the window. Teaching. Women start teaching, even though it started out primarily as a male job, and they're allowed to teach as long as they're single. Once you marry, you can no longer be a teacher, because y'all are adults enough to understand this. Once you're married, you're having relations. And everybody knows you're having relations because you're married, and especially if you get pregnant. Now, how that is supposed to rub off on the kids and be a bad influence, I'm not sure, but it was, and so only single women could teach. Women, however, at this time period the middle class is growing. And when you have a growing middle class, you have women with time on their hands, primarily, because the men are making more money. Women don't have to work. They're not working on the farm. So women are starting to get involved in religious and benevolent work. This middle class affluence is going to give them time to get involved, and they're going to start getting involved in abolitionist groups, in women's rights groups, and all kinds of reform groups. And reform is going to be our next topic. So we'll get into that more. But this Jacksonian period is really marked by this, I pointed that, and that's actually where I need to be pointing. It still works. This rags to riches becomes a durable myth during the Jacksonian period. This Jacksonian idea that everybody is equal to be as unequal as they can be. And it's a falsehood. I mean, yes, you can work hard. Some people make it big. A lot of people don't. In 1828, the top 1% of New York families held 40% of the wealth. So that means the rest of them, 99% of the population is going to share that other 60% of the wealth. The top 4% held 76% of the wealth. So that knocks it down even worse. That means 96% were sharing 26% of the wealth. 96% of the population is sharing 26% of the wealth. You're getting a big divide at this time between the really rich and the really poor. But they're still even the poor are still better off than they are in Europe. America is at this point truly the land of opportunity. And there's a word there, standard of living is much better in the US than it is anywhere else in the world. And it is an age of growth. There is a growing economy, but also social inequity. But it's all part of the growth process. And since we finished that, I will put the test up for lesson 9, and we will start the American Renaissance next time. So we have one more section on this time period. And it's more social history, so it's not politics. All right, y'all have a great weekend. Find some Irish drinking songs to sing.
Have a good week.
You too. Okay, take care.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I love y'all. I think y'all look so sharp when you're in uniform.
Thanks.
I know nobody wants to wear them.
Oh yeah, why I was late today.